Oh, okay.
Yay.
Okay, everyone, that works somehow. Yay, everyone came back. Okay, great. Oh, I was a little panicked about that. But anyways, so welcome to session 2 with Marcelo and Brown Girl Green. This is the Brown Girl Green podcast where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about how they are working to address membership and workplace diversity and inclusion in the environmental field. So we're bringing back Marcelo into the conversation. We had a really rich conversation in the first session, which you can go back and watch on the replay later on if you weren't able to catch us for the first 30 minutes. And in this next 30-minute session, I just wanted to discuss with Marcelo more about his cultural background. And, oh, 1 second. There's no video right now in the second session. Oh, no. Did I add you? Can everyone else who's live see this? If you can message in the chat box and let us know. Oh, you can hear me, but you can't see us?
Wow.
Oh, yes, I can see you. Okay, I can see you. Okay.
Oh, man, I thought I was able to change into my pajamas or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think, I know, like we do crazy dance or something. Okay, everyone can see it.
Great.
I'm not sure why you can't see it, Javier, but okay.
Yay!
All right. But I guess, okay, moving into this session, and you can also watch the replay later on because it'll be online later on. And basically, what I wanted to first discuss is both Marcelo and I are Filipino Americans, and shout out Pinoy Pride. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about what it's like being a Filipino American in this space. I think it's really important to me to see representation of my people in this field because I don't see it often. And I mean, we've talked about it offline, off screen, about how we're both kind of Filipino unicorns in this space. So I just want to talk about, what your experience has been, like your nuanced experience as a Filipino American has been in the environmental space. What have been some challenges, but also some benefits of having that perspective and bringing that into the field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Thank you. The one thing you're bringing up is the importance of role models, first of all, of when environmental institutions, one of the many benefits of doing diversity, equity, inclusion is that when you start getting representation, especially at that leadership level, people can see themselves in the movement or be a part of that organization, right? But when we don't see ourselves, it becomes a question mark. Can I see myself in that space? So I just wanted to mention that piece because I've sought role models my whole career as well. And I've had the privy to have some wonderful mentors put me under their wings, but actually none of them were Filipino in the environmental movement. So that brings me to kind of what is that like? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? The one thing that comes up for me is because we're first of all, there's a growing amount of people of color in general, but then when we look at start looking at our specific race or ethnicity and seeing where's this connection, there's not many of us. And I think for me that has given me the opportunity to be in spaces to really be effective at seeing people and working and communicating across difference, and which is really important to the work that I do. And so I'm constantly in these spaces of, if we're looking at race and ethnicity, constantly in these spaces where there's no choice. There's no other Filipinos in the room to connect to, and if I want to be effective in this space, I need to know how to see people, how to listen, how to understand other people's culture. I also want to mention that I'm biracial. So I grew up. My mom's Filipino. My dad's white American. So I grew up in a bicultural household, you could say, and being able to. So I actually lived in this tension of on the edge of being both. If you could understand this, and I know biracial people understand this.
Yes.
I'm at this tension of being fully in and not being fully in. Two different cultures. Right. So there's times where I feel like I could be accepted, but there's always something there that reminds me, you're not fully Filipino. Yeah, you don't speak Tagalog, or or you know what, you're not fully white because you're brown and you don't look like the rest of us, right? Yeah. So, and there's also ways I could walk and maneuver, like being in a predominantly white neighborhood growing up. I understand that culture and that very conservative culture that could come about, as well as that the problematic pieces, opportunities and problematic pieces of the liberal perspective as well around race. And then the same thing in the Filipino culture. I could maneuver in and understand the cultures, some of the language, still learning. While also knowing that I'm still at this tension in between. So I think that experience has given me the skills to be able to walk more seamlessly among different cultures, and has just led. I just feel like has really provided this opportunity to do good work in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and to help the environmental movement as a whole be more relevant and connected to more people.
Well, I personally look up to you, and I'm sure a lot of other Filipino Americans who are listening and maybe in the space probably don't even know that people like us exist. So we are putting it out there now. It's visual. It's happening right now.
We're out there.
We're out there.
Yeah. For all those Filipinos listening to, and all people of color and white allies, I love coaching and supporting folks out there, especially those that are having some tough times within the environmental movement. So I don't know, we'll share an email. I don't know at the end. Feel free to reach out to me.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing all of that. I now want to move into this piece about, where do we move forward with all of this information? We understand that the problems are very apparent, and they're still apparent 50 years later, as you've mentioned, in terms of environmental inequity in the workplace. But what do we do from here? How do organizations move forward to create the necessary cultural shifts? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm gonna share things that are probably they're definitely not as widespread out there of what needs to happen. Like I think one of the challenges right now is moving folks from well, let me step back. When I first started entering the space, started the Center for Diversity and Environment back 13 years ago, a big challenge was just convincing people and institutions why it's important to do diversity, equity, inclusion. Demographics are changing. It's the right thing to do. We're going to be more effective as an environmental movement. You're going to be able to deliver better on your mission. And we're not a shrinking demographic and a shrinking cause that's going to whittle away. It could help us, be relevant. So that now that still needs to continue to happen, but we have a large chunk of folks and organizations that are trying to do this work, really interested. And now the challenge gets into the how. How do we, and the quality of the work? Because I could argue that for the amount of institutions that are doing this work, I would say probably half to 2/3 is going to be shocking to some folks, aren't doing it effectively well at all. A third might actually be a generous estimate of doing it well. And this is what I mean. I talked about informational versus transformational, and the other thing I like to share is that a lot of organizations see this as an intellectual exercise. Like, let's just analyze. Let's look at some numbers. Let's look at what we're doing and not doing. Let's put together a checklist and start putting those pieces in place. Let's create a diversity council. Let's do a training. But after we do each one, let's check it off and we did good and pat ourselves on the back. Without any deeper understanding of a training is only as good as it feeding into a broader strategy and broader movement forward, right? Diversity. I've seen so many diversity councils that just don't work well, and I've seen a few diversity councils that do work well. So this gets into the how do we do this work, and I think if we focus on two things, one is transformation. Engaging the heart and head, and really starting with the individual. Transformation on an individual level is the only first step you can take to effectively transform on the organizational level. A lot of organizations just like, nope, we want to just do the organizational work. I don't want to work on myself. I want to work on the organization. But the organization is only going to be as effective as the representation of the DEI competence of the individuals that make it up. So if you're still a bunch of kindergartners in this space, you have intention to become a graduate student, but you're not creating that pathway for yourself, you're going to continue to have kindergarten level organizational work, which is not very effective, right? So we got to work on ourselves, and it's going to take time, just like it takes time to get from being kindergarten to a graduate level. It's going to take time. It's going to be a journey. The other piece I want to mention is, if we focus on love, I mean, we heard Martin Luther King Jr. talk about it all the time, and there are a number of quotes talking about love. There's no enemy of love. Nothing can conquer love, right? That if we focus there, then we could start seeing each other. We could start being more relational, which is core to this work. It's not transactional; it's relational. I mean, you could argue it's both. It's a both and. Transactional by itself doesn't work, but transactional and love and relational will work every time. So I wanted to share this quote because it's just I came across it, and it's just totally speaks to me and what this work's all about. It's by Thomas Merton, and he says, "The beginning of love is the will to let those we love be perfectly themselves. The resolution not to twist them to fit our image." It's so deep and so connected to this work. So, it's just a simple. We oftentimes people shy away from the love piece because they think it's the soft, ineffective approach. But in my work, I have found love, which is connected to compassion and empathy and humility and seeing others. When people go to love, that's where I've seen the breakthroughs. But it takes courage to folks to get there, because we live in a culture that doesn't totally overtly support and say that that's what we need to do, but it is, and that's where I see breakthroughs. And I could say the opposite, where I've seen organizations and individuals falter in this space is when they don't bring love, when they think selfishly, they're thinking about themselves, they have an ego that's getting in the way from seeing others. It's night and day. People ask me all the time, like, how do we know if someone's ready, or what's the readiness? I'm like, just look at their personality. If they're humble and they're about empathy and compassion, they're going to go a long way. If they're still about themselves, they're about ego, and just engaged in their own power and privilege and looking out for themselves, they're going to go nowhere, and arguably they're going to make things worse.
Yes. So I really want to get to the questions. I'm going to pull up the first question. So Alfredo asks, what role can philanthropy play in getting more people of color into green jobs and to retain them in the long term?
Thank you, Alfredo. How are you doing? Actually, I can't hear your response, so hope you're doing well. So yeah, thank you for this question. I think this is, philanthropy has a huge role to play, especially in the nonprofit space. There's a lot of power and privilege in that space. There's this great effort that just started through the Environmental Grantmakers Association around a fellowship, diverse fellowship, matching all folks, not just people of color. It's very racially focused, people of color and white folks, into matching them in foundations and institutions, and it's backed by and funded by foundations. So I'll just mention that's a good start. That's not the end of itself, though, because what I'm finding is some places where these folks are being placed the institutions aren't ready for them. They haven't created an inclusive culture. They don't have systems in place to set up these individuals for success, and some of them actually have challenges. So I'm not saying all of them. Some of them have great experiences, but just some of the stories I've heard. And I'm saying that also more generally, not just this fellowship, but all fellowship. I was part of a fellowship when I was at Meyer Memorial Trust, which I'm very grateful for the opportunity, where it placed 9 people of color in foundations across the Pacific Northwest. And I hold that experience in tension. It was a great experience on one hand. I was matched in a foundation that was doing some great work around diversity, equity, inclusion that not a lot of other foundations were doing, and I also see this problematic space of people seeing this fellowship as the answer. It's not the answer. It's one piece of a broader strategic puzzle that we need to be working on, and I found fellows in that experience as well struggling, and some having great experiences. So it all comes down to, again, it's not addressing the root issue. It's helping the representation and the diversity piece, but we have to be working on the inclusions piece. Like what I would love in these spaces would be dollars that go to the individual fellow and dollars that go to the host institution to be doing their work. And if they're not committed to doing that, then don't place the fellow there, because you could do more damage than good if you're not ready. I know a number of folks, people of color who've worked in the movement, whether it's through fellowship experiences, that they've left the environmental movement. They love the environment, but they left the movement. They just had such a horrible experience, and they're jaded, rightfully so. I even went through that process when I had my experience as the only person of color at Defenders of Wildlife. I went through, I could probably arguably say I was depressed for a couple months, because I was just like, what am I going to do? I don't want to go to a space where I'm going to be treated like crap, but I love the environment and I love protecting wildlife. That is my passion, and that's what I'm committed to. And so what led me to is like, okay, well, if I want to make things better, I got to make things better. If I want to work on wildlife conservation and hang out with piping plovers, endangered piping plovers in the Massachusetts coastline, which is one of my favorite jobs ever, again, then we got to do our work first as an environmental movement. So the other pieces around philanthropy, what they can do is, on the programmatic side, it's supporting more people of color, start overfunding the underfunded organizations and start underfunding the overfunded organizations. So what that means is the mainstream environmental organizations have been taking all the money for years, and they're effective at some things, but they're very ineffective at a lot of things. They're just taking the money to take the money. And there are so many grassroots, community-based organizations, environmental justice, climate justice organizations doing incredible work on peanuts. So utilizing, and those are the people you want to fund because they know how to stretch a dollar. And I know this I've been a funder for 2 years. Those are organizations I want to fund when I was at Meyer Memorial Trust. And here's the sad thing. One thing was I was in a space where I could recommend that. But what has happened in the space is there are a ton of white-led environmental groups. So in Oregon, Portland, you could find more, 10 to 20 salmon-focused groups. But then when you focus on EJ, you might have one. If you expand the definition, maybe we have 3. But really, we need. And then there's a lot of people of color-led organizations that have EJ or climate change programs. So what we find is we have all these funds that could go to people of color-led organizations and efforts, but you know what? There aren't a ton of them because they've been underfunded so long. There hasn't been funding for new and innovative ways of doing things, and that's what we need to provide the dollars first in the philanthropy space. And when we do that and doing that in a real and meaningful way, it's going to go to more effective work. It's going to lead to innovation because that's what happens when you support diverse efforts, different ways of looking at things and approaching things. And I want to make the argument that we need innovation badly now. We're losing in the climate space. There's little wins here and there, but we don't know how to talk to people as a movement. As a mainstream climate change movement, we don't know how to talk to people beyond our own choir. Mm-hmm. I say that as an absolute, but of course there's some people out there who know how to do it. But overall, that lack of communication skills across difference is what's stop pointing fingers at other people, and we need to start pointing fingers at ourselves and figuring out how we can do better, rather than saying you need to do better, because that's never going to change. As soon as I can do something better and know how to talk to you about what you care about and connect it to climate change, then that's when we're going to make progress.
Definitely. I think I'm so glad you brought that up, because I personally think that the climate movement is stagnating or not making the progress it needs to make, because it's not reaching a broader demographic and it's not reflective of the people of the global majority. And I think that the narratives and the stories that are being brought up in this space aren't reflective of the actual makeup of the American people today. And so, that's one of my main goals of Brown Girl Green, is to bring on folks like you and other environmental professionals and leaders of color who can speak to this issue and can bring up how we can change the story of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. So I'm super glad you spoke on all of that. So if anyone else has any last questions, you can write in the Ask a Question box. But I'm going to ask a quick question for my own personal interest. I just want to know what you do for personal self-care. Like, in this work, it's very emotionally draining in some ways, and it's very frustrating to just always have to put yourself out there in really vulnerable and bold ways just to get your voice heard. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you do to take care of yourself?
Yeah, great question. It's really, really important in this work, both for folks who are focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and just being a person of color in the environmental space. We need to, that's where a lot of my coaching has been with people of color in the space, is that self-care. And the best I can do is just share what has worked with me and my own journey, because it still continues to be a journey. I'm still trying to find that right balance. And I've had some real dips and I've had some real ups in the space. And the one consistent space is I'm spiritual, I'm Christian, and so have my time with the Bible, with Jesus and God every morning, at least for 10 minutes, gets me in a good space, a good foundation for the day. And I found when I have the difference between having a good or bad day sometimes comes down to, did I make time that morning? And the amazing thing about it for me is, like, I'm not a morning person. I'm a night person, but I found when I do this, I find real value of really being centering myself. So, and that also goes into a lot of Christian practices in the faith. Right now I'm dabbling into centering prayer, this unique way of praying where you're just emptying your mind, which sounds weird, but it's doing some amazing things in me right now. So I think being connected to my faith has really stabilized. I think being really connected to my family is really, really important to me. My two daughters, understanding that, life is not just work. It's just a small space of this work. And a lot of what I do today is to create a better world for my 12 and 15-year-old daughters. Because I talk about, me being biracial. My kids are multiracial. I'm married. My wife is Jamaican. So my girls are like multiracial, right? And they're just beautiful and really connecting to their multicultural identities in real meaningful ways, and having this great insight. So, so if there's a spiritual space for you, spiritual practice, do that consistently. Think about family and friends around you, lean on them, see what your support network is. I try to be healthy in all aspects. So continually, engage what fills you up. So in general, so like for me, running and playing soccer fills me up. And so I stay in that physical, healthy space. But I would say in general, this idea of what fills you up. So make sure you make time for that. It may be some aspects of your work. It may be a hobby. It may be an extracurricular. It may be just spending time with loved ones. But think about, like, when you're done with that activity, that at the end you feel this fullness, because there's work, especially on diversity, equity, inclusion work and thinking about race. There's a lot of things that could start emptying us, taking away our energy, because we're worrying, we're facing microaggressions, or we're seeing microaggressions, or there's the systemic issues that are a challenge, and systemic issues don't get fixed overnight. So those are some pieces that really work for me. Like I at one point I took soccer out of my life, because I was like, oh, it has no relevance to my work. I played my whole life. I played in college. I played professionally. And then I'm like, oh, I don't need it anymore. But you know what? Because I'm like, what does that serve? But for me, I've come back to it because it fills me up. So it's a space where I can enjoy, and it gives me energy, especially in those tough, hard days where I'm starting to get drained.
Amazing. Wow, we're already almost done with our second half. We could talk for hours. There's so much to cover, and there's so many challenges and opportunities in this space. But unfortunately, we'll have to start concluding our session for today. And I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me in my journey towards creating Brown Girl Green and being a part of this story. And I just wanted to know if you could leave our listeners with any resources or any big statements you'd like to leave them with.
Pressure's on. So resource. First of all, I want to mention, that light behind you right now is making you look very angelic, and it's like this. So it's awesome. So just some resources. I would say that State of Diversity in the Environment report. Diversegreen.org is Green 2.0's website, and you can find that report there. I would say if you want to look up the article I co-wrote with Charles Jordan, Diversifying the Environmental Movement, that's actually placed, I think, on the Center for Diversity and Environment's resources page, so cdeinspires.org. And there's also just a wealth of information there. If you're looking to just learn and soak it in, there's a bunch of stuff there you could look into. So, overall, I want to say, well, first of all, thank you. It's been an honor, and especially being one of your first guests on this new crowdcast approach. I really feel honored that you reached out to me. We're in a time and a place where we have choices. We have choices every day in front of us around, can we make this, do we want to make this place a better place to live for everyone? And if the answer is yes, then we need to be intentional, and also keeping that in line with what are our passions, what are our strengths, how can I move the mantle forward? And for me, finding that nice space of this passion of wanting to change these things that are so systemic and so institutionalized and just so part of our culture, it can be very frustrating because it's so huge. But when you bring it down back to yourself, and for me, when I brought it back to myself and figured out, what are my God-given talents? What are my passions? What are my strengths? And lots of times you could figure out your strengths is what really comes easy to you. And you look around you, it's like, oh, that's not easy for you. Oh, okay. Well, I didn't mean to rub it in, but maybe that's a strength of mine that I need to take advantage of, and really identify how could my strengths and my talents match with where I want to see this world. And once you get into that space, I feel, sky's the limit in the change that you can make. Like, I've been really humbled and surprised I've gone to this space in my career to be able to, for people actually call me up and want to give me money to help them do this work that I love doing and so passionate about. So I would just say, connect to that passion and your strengths and talents, because the world needs that. We need that from you individually. So I just, and carry forward love in everything you do.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone who stuck around through all these technical challenges and just joining in on this conversation, asking awesome questions. This is Chrissy Drutman with Marcelo Bonta, and this is Brown Girl Green, and I'll catch you at the next episode. Thanks everyone. Bye.